The year was 1950. America was changing. The war had ended, but fear had only taken on a new shape. The Cold War brought suspicion into every corner of daily life. In that quiet tension, when people were afraid to ask questions, a young woman named Louisa Harper vanished from public view. She was 27, a journalist and activist who had spent the past 3 years investigating conditions inside the southern prison system. Louisa wrote about missing inmates, strange medical tests, and the steady disappearance of records that should have been public. Her articles rarely saw print. Local editors called her reckless, and state officials called her dangerous, but she kept writing. On April 5th, she was driving home from a meeting with an attorney when 2 men in plain clothes stopped her car. They told her she was under investigation for leaking government information. She asked for a warrant. They showed none. She was calm when they led her away. A neighbor who saw it from across the street later said it looked less like an arrest and more like an abduction. After that, her name disappeared from every file. No booking record, no police report, no newspaper mention. For a week, she simply ceased to exist. When her name finally reappeared, it was in a county logbook stating that she had been transferred to a federal holding facility. That too was false. Louisa had been taken to a place called Grayson County Correctional Camp, a facility that did not appear on any public map. Officially, it was a reformatory for violent offenders. In truth, it was a private institution used for behavioral experiments financed by military and academic contracts. The camp was built in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by pine forest and barbed wire. The guards were told to ask no questions about new arrivals. Most of them didn't. That spring, Louisa became one of several civilians delivered there without trial. The intake logs listed her under a code name, Subject L9. No one knew exactly what the project was, only that it was referred to as Program 9. Researchers were studying human endurance, group behavior, and psychological control under confinement. Louisa's arrest had provided them with an ideal subject: intelligent, outspoken, and unwanted by the system. On the night she arrived, the rain fell hard enough to drown the sound of the truck that brought her in. The guard who processed her later recalled that she looked neither afraid nor defiant, only exhausted. She was given a gray uniform and placed in cell 9. Inside were 9 male inmates, all serving long sentences. No explanation was given for the arrangement. The door was locked, the lights turned off, and for 3 days, no one entered. What happened inside those 72 hours was never recorded. When the cell was opened again, the men were silent and uncooperative. Louisa sat against the wall, staring into the darkness. She did not speak or react. There were no visible injuries, but something in her expression convinced even the hardened guards that something had gone terribly wrong. The next morning, she was removed from the cell and transferred to an isolated medical wing. Her condition was listed as psychological collapse. Within days, her file was marked for federal transfer and then disappeared entirely. For almost 30 years, no one could find a trace of her. In 1979, a librarian at a university archive opened a box of unsorted prison correspondence from the early 50s. Inside were 3 letters signed only with the initials LH. Each was written in careful, deliberate handwriting and carried a faded stamp with the number 9. The content was disturbing and strangely detached, describing a controlled environment where identity was systematically stripped away. The tone was clinical, almost as if written by someone observing her own breakdown from a distance. Those letters became the foundation of an investigation that revealed a network of hidden experiments across the American prison system. The details were fragmented, but the outline was clear. In the name of science, the government had allowed human beings to be used as test material, and Louisa Harper had been one of them. Her story, once buried under decades of silence, forced the nation to look at a truth it had long refused to face. Louisa was never officially found. Some said she died in confinement, others believed she escaped and lived under another name. What mattered was that her disappearance exposed a system willing to erase a person to protect its secrets. By the time her letters reached the public, most of the officials involved were dead or unreachable. The institutions that had once hidden behind research grants and security clearances denied everything. But Louisa's name remained, tied forever to a single phrase scrawled in an old ledger: Program 9. Her fate was never solved, yet her silence spoke for all the others who vanished in those years. The story of Louisa Harper became a warning, a reminder that even in times of peace, there are places where truth itself can be imprisoned. By the time Louisa Harper arrived at Grayson County Correctional Camp, the building was already steeped in secrecy. Few knew its full purpose, and fewer still questioned the activities within. The camp looked ordinary from the outside: high brick walls, barbed wire, guard towers, and the standard lines of barracks. But inside, its structure was designed for control, not rehabilitation. Every hallway, every door, every lock had been placed to allow observation and manipulation of those. Within, Cell 9 was at the end of a long corridor, isolated from the rest of the camp. It had been prepared in advance. The men already inside were seasoned inmates, each serving long sentences for serious crimes. None of them had been informed about the new addition, nor why she was placed there. The room itself was small, cold, and bare, a single light bulb flickering overhead, a metal toilet in one corner, and a narrow cot against the wall. No windows looked outside. The guards' instructions were simple: leave them alone and report nothing unusual. The experiment, as the documents later revealed, was designed to study the dynamics of stress, authority, and fear. The presence of Louisa, a civilian and outsider, introduced a variable that researchers intended to watch closely. For 72 hours, no one entered the cell. Observation was conducted through hidden vents and cameras. Nothing was logged in official files. Everything was considered classified. The men were instructed to follow normal routines, but the reality of the experiment disrupted all routines. Inside, the atmosphere shifted immediately. The men were tense, uncertain how to respond to Louisa's presence. She said little, moving quietly, keeping to herself. Her silence became a mirror to the men's own anxieties. Guards noted later that the group's behavior changed dramatically over hours, though no one outside understood why. Confined together, isolated from any external influence, the inmates displayed a mixture of suspicion, aggression, and unexpected cooperation. The documents, discovered decades later, described physiological and psychological changes in the subjects. Elevated heart rates, altered sleep cycles, rapid mood swings. Louisa's presence had a noticeable impact. She did not act as a participant, yet her mere existence in the environment altered the men's behavior. Researchers recorded that the stress created an intense dynamic in which dominance, submission, and negotiation all played out silently. By the second day, the situation inside Cell 9 had intensified. The men argued quietly among themselves, their voices low but sharp, testing boundaries. Louisa remained motionless for much of the time, yet her movements, small gestures, where she chose to sit, how she interacted, became the focal point of the group. In the reports, researchers noted that the men alternated between aggression and protection, forming a complex social structure around her presence. The outside world remained unaware, Guards walked past without engaging. Meals were delivered with minimal interaction. Cameras recorded every subtle movement. The files indicate that the researchers had hypothesized that introducing a civilian into a high-risk environment would reveal patterns of control, cooperation, and conflict. What they did not predict was the degree to which human adaptability would manifest. On the third day, the group reached a tipping point. Small disputes flared into confrontation and then subsided. Louisa's composure, her careful silence, and her resilience seemed to stabilize the group unexpectedly. The researchers noted this in their observations. Her presence, rather than destabilizing the environment, created a new equilibrium. The experiment, they concluded, had produced results that challenged their assumptions about stress, control, and authority. When the door finally opened on the 73rd hour, the guards were ordered to remove her from the cell immediately. The men were left to return to their previous routines. Louisa was transferred to the medical wing, her condition assessed, but no external injuries noted. Psychological evaluations recorded exhaustion, emotional detachment, and signs of acute stress, but nothing that could fully convey the experience within those 3 days. Later, investigators would describe Cell 9 as a microcosm of power and fear. The experiment revealed how social hierarchies form under confinement, how individuals adapt under extreme conditions, and how one person's presence can alter group behavior in unforeseen ways. Louisa Harper, a civilian trapped in a controlled environment with 9 men for 3 days, became the center of a study that was never published, never acknowledged, and carefully erased from public record. What emerged decades later from uncovered files was a stark reminder of the hidden experiments conducted in the post-war era. The details of Cell 9, once buried, exposed not only the extremes of human endurance, but also the moral compromises of a system willing to treat people as variables in a controlled study. Louisa's experience would remain an extraordinary account of survival, observation, and the human capacity to withstand imposed isolation and manipulation. Even without visible harm, the psychological impact was profound. Her removal from the cell marked the end of the experiment, but not the end of its consequences. Louisa Harper's brief confinement within Cell 9 became a window into the hidden operations of a prison system that blurred the line between justice and experimentation, and it set the stage for decades of investigation, secrecy, and eventual discovery. After Louisa Harper's removal from Cell 9, the camp returned to its outwardly ordinary routine. Guards resumed their shifts, prisoners returned to their assigned tasks, and the facility maintained the appearance of a standard correctional institution. Yet behind the brick walls, a complex system of documentation, observation, and secret reporting continued uninterrupted. The events inside the cell were never intended to be part of a public record. They existed only in the hidden files maintained by researchers and select officials. These files were meticulous. Every movement, every shift in posture, every glance was noted. Louisa's behavior was analyzed as if she were an object rather than a person, a variable in a controlled experiment. Researchers recorded her silence, her measured steps, her ability to maintain composure, and the ways she influenced the 9 men around her. Even subtle gestures, turning her head, choosing where to sit, or pausing before responding, were catalogued. For decades, these documents remained classified, locked, in federal archives, with access limited to a small circle of scientists and government officials. The files were stamped with codes, numeric designations, and notes written in shorthand that only insiders could interpret. Louisa Harper's true identity was replaced with the impersonal label Subject L9, as if the human being at the center of the study had been erased. The existence of the files was known only to a few. Within the camp, staff whispered cautiously about the experiment, careful not to speak too loudly or draw attention. Among the 9 men, conversations about Louisa were rare, fragmented, and filtered by their own fear of reprisal. The camp's administration ensured that no one outside could piece together the events, and they manipulated the official record to maintain complete secrecy. Years later, as the Cold War intensified and oversight of human experimentation increased, portions of the files were relocated, consolidated, or destroyed. Investigators decades afterward would find only fragments, yellowed pages filled with codes, partially legible charts, and typed reports that referenced experiments on group dynamics, stress responses, and behavioral control. The context of Louisa's presence was obscured by layers of technical language, acronyms, and scientific jargon. Despite this, the surviving documents revealed the extraordinary precision with which the experiment had been conducted. Every aspect of Cell 9 had been engineered to test the limits of human endurance and social interaction. Environmental variables were controlled, lighting was adjusted, temperature monitored, and sounds introduced in calculated intervals. The observers sought to measure stress thresholds, conflict resolution, and patterns of cooperation or dominance. Louisa's role, though unacknowledged in public discourse, was central to these observations. The files also contained handwritten notations from a supervising officer, offering brief glimpses into the camp's philosophy. They reflected a view of prisoners as test subjects, a population to be studied rather than protected. The annotations suggested that deviations in expected behavior were treated as data points rather than signs of human distress. Even when Louisa's composure appeared to stabilize the group unexpectedly, the researchers documented it clinically, noting anomalies without consideration for the ethical implications. Over time, the hidden files became more than just a record of an experiment. They were a testament to a culture of secrecy, control, and institutional disregard for individual rights. They showed how a single civilian, thrust into an environment of confinement and observation, could reveal the contradictions and failures of a system designed to manipulate behavior. Louisa Harper's presence in Cell 9 had created data that challenged the researchers' assumptions, but in doing so, it exposed the moral compromises at the heart of the operation. It would be decades before the files resurfaced. In university archives, in federal repositories, and in private collections, fragments of Louisa's experience began to emerge. Scholars, journalists, and former staff pieced together the outline of what had occurred, uncovering the methods, the structure, and the human cost of Cell 9. The documents provided a window into a world that had been intentionally hidden, revealing a story of resilience, observation, and the quiet endurance of one woman who had been reduced to a subject in a system determined to erase her. By reconstructing the timeline from these fragmented files, historians were able to demonstrate not only the scope of the experiment, but also its significance. Cell 9 was more than an isolated incident. It represented a broader network of controlled studies within the prison system, part of a period in American history where ethics and oversight were minimal. Louisa Harper's experience became central to understanding this hidden dimension, her story a critical link between the human consequences of confinement and the scientific ambitions that ignored them. Though the files were incomplete and many pages lost, the surviving documentation ensured that Louisa's ordeal would not be forgotten. The hidden files, once a symbol of suppression, ultimately became the key to revealing the truth about Cell 9 and the system that had sought to contain and control her. Her experience, preserved in ink and paper, became a testament to resilience and the enduring impact of observation on those who were forced to endure it. By the late 1970s, whispers about Grayson County Correctional Camp and the mysterious events of Cell 9 began to surface beyond the confines of government archives. Louisa Harper's letters, discovered by chance in a university collection, had attracted the attention of investigative journalists. These letters, sparse yet precise, hinted at a controlled experiment that had never been acknowledged publicly. For the first time, outsiders began to piece together a story that had been deliberately erased. The journalists approached former prison staff, but decades had passed. Memories were faded, intentionally distorted or suppressed. Many guards and administrators had either retired or were deceased. Those who remained were hesitant to speak, some fearful of legal consequences, others unwilling to acknowledge complicity. Yet the letters contained enough detail to direct reporters towards specific dates, locations, and institutional practices, offering clues to reconstruct the sequence of events. The investigation revealed that Louisa Harper had been placed in Cell 9 as part of a behavioral study conducted under the supervision of federal contractors and local prison authorities. The experiment had been designed to observe social dynamics under extreme isolation and controlled stress. The presence of a civilian female, deliberately placed among 9 male inmates, had been recorded as a variable in evaluating power, cooperation, and psychological resilience. Researchers had logged her actions meticulously without regard for her humanity. Interviews with former inmates conducted with careful discretion corroborated some of Louisa's observations. They described an environment where small actions could trigger tension or temporary harmony, a microcosm of control and uncertainty. The men themselves had been unsure how to behave, their routines disrupted, their roles in the social hierarchy unsettled by her presence. Some recalled being instructed by guards to avoid engagement. Others remembered subtle manipulations that tested their response to stress. Investigators also located fragments of internal reports. These included charts, behavioral logs, and coded notations, all confirming that the experiment had been planned, monitored, and analyzed systematically. There were references to physiological readings, mental assessments, and controlled environmental adjustments, all designed to study human response under extreme conditions. Louisa Harper, now referred to in the documents only as Subject L9, appeared consistently as a stabilizing force, contrary to the researchers' expectations. The reconstruction of events painted a chilling picture. The prison administration, the research teams, and the federal contractors had collaborated to design an environment where human behavior could be manipulated without oversight. Ethical guidelines, as we understand them today, were non-existent. The experiment blurred the lines between observation and coercion, using confinement, isolation, and social uncertainty as tools to extract data from unwilling participants. This phase of the investigation drew public attention when the journalists published a series of reports detailing the existence of Cell 9. For the first time, the public learned of Louisa Harper, the civilian subjected to confinement among male inmates under controlled conditions. Headlines called attention to the secrecy, the oversight failures, and the broader implications for civil rights and human dignity. The story sparked debates in academic circles, legal forums, and the media, highlighting the dangerous intersection of research, incarceration, and government authority. While the initial reports were fragmented, they were enough to prompt further scrutiny. Federal records, previously inaccessible, were examined under Freedom of Information requests. Former researchers and officials, some reluctant and others defensive, were compelled to testify. The letters Louisa had written decades earlier became central evidence, a rare first-hand account detailing how she endured isolation, maintained composure, and observed the group dynamics within Cell 9. Through careful analysis, The investigators confirmed that the experiment had not been incidental. It was part of a broader system in which human beings were used as test subjects without informed consent. Louisa Harper's presence had been deliberate, her endurance measured, and her psychological state documented as part of a controlled study. The moral and ethical implications of these findings shocked the nation and raised questions about accountability, oversight, and the treatment of vulnerable populations in institutional settings. By the end of this phase, Louisa Harper's story had transformed from a forgotten footnote into a central narrative about resilience, secrecy, and the limits of authority. The investigation illuminated how carefully orchestrated environments could manipulate human behavior, and how one individual's presence could alter an entire group dynamic. The story of Cell 9 had moved from hidden files and whispers into public awareness, exposing the extent to which human lives had been treated as data points in a controlled experiment. By the early 1980s, the story of Louisa Harper and Cell 9 had moved from isolated reports to national attention. Scholars, journalists, and former prison staff began to piece together decades of secrecy. The hidden files, letters, and eyewitness accounts revealed a chilling reality. The experiment had been meticulously designed, sanctioned by authorities, and deliberately concealed from the public. Louisa's endurance, her ability to maintain composure under extreme conditions, became emblematic of human resilience. Yet the system that had confined her remained largely unaccountable. Public hearings were convened to examine the practices of the Grayson County Correctional Camp. Federal oversight agencies acknowledged that experiments like Cell 9 had violated fundamental principles of human dignity. However, due to the passage of time and the destruction of many original records, no prosecutions were pursued. The focus shifted instead to documenting the experiences, understanding the methodology, and exposing the institutional failures that had allowed such experiments to occur. Louisa Harper's letters, once overlooked, became central to the investigation. They provided a first-hand account of the conditions within Cell 9, the subtle dynamics among the 9 male inmates, and the psychological pressures imposed by confinement and observation. Researchers who had once treated her as a subject were now confronted with the enduring impact of their work. The letters revealed not only the procedural details of the experiment, but also the human consequences: isolation, fear, and the subtle erosion of autonomy that occurred in a controlled environment. Historians and journalists emphasized the significance of her story beyond the immediate events. Cell 9 was not merely an isolated incident. It represented a broader pattern of experimentation on prisoners and civilians during the post-war period. Ethical standards, accountability, and oversight had been minimal, allowing human lives to be manipulated in pursuit of data. Louisa Harper became a symbol of the silent individuals whose experiences had been erased or ignored. Her endurance offered insight into both the resilience of the human spirit and the systemic failures that permitted abuse. Over time, Louisa's story influenced policy and academic discourse. Scholars examined the long-term psychological effects of forced isolation and the ethical implications of observational experiments on vulnerable populations. Her letters were published in historical journals, incorporated into educational programs, and cited in debates on prison reform and human rights. Cell 9, once hidden, became a case study in the consequences of unmonitored institutional power. The public's perception of Louisa Harper shifted from anonymous victim to emblem of courage and endurance. Her experience illuminated the dangers of unchecked authority and the need for ethical oversight in all human research. Even decades later, her story prompted reflection on how easily individuals can be dehumanized within systems designed for control. and how crucial it is to preserve evidence and testimony for future generations. Though Louisa's own fate remained partially unknown, the legacy of her ordeal endured. The documents, letters, and reconstructed accounts ensured that Cell 9 would never be forgotten. Her experience exposed the limits of institutional morality, the importance of vigilance, and the capacity of a single individual to leave a lasting mark on history despite extreme adversity. The revelation of Cell 9 ultimately became more than an account of suffering. It became a lens through which to examine the human cost of secrecy, the power of observation, and the courage required to survive and bear witness. Louisa Harper's story serves as a reminder that even when institutions attempt to erase individuals, the truth can endure, and that resilience, observation, and courage can outlast even the most controlled and oppressive circumstances.